Hey, good afternoon, or it's not afternoon anymore. Good evening, everybody. Um, Thank you, Scott. So I'm very excited to introduce Dr. Joan Morrison this evening as our presenter. I do get the privilege to work with her pretty often, so I'm excited to introduce her tonight. So Dr. Joan is a retired professor of biology and environmental science from Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. She received her Ph.D. in Wildlife Ecology and Conservation from the University of Florida. And since beginning her dissertation research in the early 90s, she has focused on population biology and habitat associations of Florida's Crested Caracara population. And she's continued that research for the past 32 years. On her postdoc, which was funded by the National Geographic Society, she studied the chimango, another caracara that inhabits agricultural areas in southern Chile. While at Trinity College, Dr. Morrison and her undergraduate students conducted studies on red-tailed hawks that lived in the urban environments of Hartford. Prior to earning her PhD, Dr. Morrison worked as a wildlife biologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in so many places, and she also worked for the U.S. Forest Service. So recently her research has expanded, her research on caracaras has expanded to focus on the Arizona population of the species. So with that, I would like to remind everybody, please make sure you're muted during the presentation. If you have any questions for Dr. Morrison, please put them in the chat. And with that, Dr. Joan, I'll let you go ahead and share your screen, and I will turn off my video and I'll mute myself.
Okay, sorry about that. It takes me a minute to figure the technology out. Can everybody hear me okay?
We can hear you perfect. Thank you, Joan.
Okay. So yeah, I'm going to talk about my 30-some years of working on this population tonight but then some updates because it's always ongoing. You never run out of things to do. And I'm going to start out by the question of how could anything like this looks like this be a Florida native, because I'm often asked that question. People say, oh, I've never seen one, first of all, or it can't possibly be a native looking like that. But it is. It's been here since the Pleistocene. And if you really want to see one, you can drive along Route 70 between West Palm Beach or Okeechobee, I guess, and Archbold Biological Station, or continue west on 70 or on 72 towards Mayaca River State Park and Sarasota, and you'll almost guaranteed see caracaras along those areas. Here is an interesting picture of a behavior I'll talk about in a little bit. But yes, this bird does have a head. It's just backwards. It tends to like to throw its head back like that as a display that we'll talk about in a minute. So a little bit of taxonomy. Can you see the whole screen? I'm almost feeling like things are being cut off there at the top.
No, we can see the whole screen.
Okay, good. Okay, so caracaras, and I should say this week because bird taxonomy is in flux and things are changing all the time. But currently they're in the falcon family with a subfamily that's different from the Falconinae, which is a subfamily that has a lot of birds that we're familiar with: kestrel, the peregrine falcon, the prairie falcon, and the aplomato falcon. But the caracaras are in a subfamily called Caracarinae. There are currently 9 extant species. The Guadalupe caracara is extinct, but there are 4 genera in the genus Falcobuenus. Now, I know some of you may have access to Birds of the World, and you see that genera are changing in that program. The Raptor Research Foundation, of which I am a member, the Professional Society for Raptor Biologists around the world, still maintains affiliation with the AOS designations of taxonomy, and we have not changed those genera yet. So I'm still using Falcobuenus caracara for the one we're talking about tonight, Milvago, 2 species, Daptrius, 1 species, which is this one here, the black caracara, Ibicter, which is the red-throated caracara, and then this is one of the Milvagos, the chimango caracaras, which is the one I studied in Chile. So this is how you often will see caracaras in Florida, perched on fence posts. They don't all have bands on like this. I wish they did, but they don't. But this is a very common way that you will see them. And when you look at the eBird maps, and this is pulled a couple days ago from eBird, I'm not going to call it a range map because if you look at the United States particularly, you'll see all these purple blocks up either coast. And we're all freaking out thinking, oh my gosh, caracaras are living in those places. Those purple blocks, those of you familiar with eBird, are simply places where there has been an occurrence at some point, generally since the beginning of eBird, about 2010. Those are what I consider to be vagrants. We'll talk about them a little bit later. So I call this an occurrence map, not a range map. But the range map actually occurs here, Florida, we have Texas and Arizona, through Central America and through most of South America. And it's now considered one species. There used to be two, but now it's only considered one. And if you get closer and zoom into the Florida population, you'll see that it's pretty limited still. There are records that are beginning to occur a little bit farther north of Orlando area into Orange County, sometimes up the coast a little bit. But again, a lot of those are simply one-offs. They're not regularly seen. The area here that is where all the dense records of pictures and videos and things are is pretty much where this population resides. So we consider it a closed population, which means that there isn't anything coming in from elsewhere or birds are not leaving. We have no evidence that Florida caracaras leave the state, at least in the 200 some that I've banded and radio tagged. My Ph.D. student, James Dwyer, banded and radio tagged birds. None of his birds were ever recorded. We've never had a band recovery outside of Florida. So we're considering it a closed population. And for all intents and purposes, it's isolated from other caracaras in Texas, Cuba, any of the other populations. At least that's what we think at this point. So Florida's caracara population is listed federally and by the state as threatened. Not endangered, but it's threatened, and that means it's under some kind of concern. So why would a population be considered threatened? Hold on, gotta let the dog in. Okay, so why would a population be considered threatened? Well, it could be that they can't reproduce. They can't find a mate, they can't reproduce because they can't find proper nesting habitat, they can't get enough food, there's some kind of stress happening on the population that they don't breed successfully. Maybe there's predation. Insufficient recruitment means that even if they are successful breeding, there are factors involved that don't let the young ever become breeders themselves. They all have high mortality and the breeding population actually begins to decline. There are other mortality factors. They can be direct persecution, hunting, shooting, poisoning. To some degree, those are still problems in Florida. Not a lot, but they're still there. And then, of course, disease and parasites can also be an issue with a population. And these kind of things, or a combination of any of those, can cause a population to become under threat. So I started my studies in 1992 as a graduate student at the University of Florida. That's a long story that we don't have time for, but suffice to say, I'd never seen the bird before until someone asked me about it. And I looked it up in the field guide and say the rest is history. So I started in about 92 and focused on 4 major areas, which is where I'm going to focus this talk tonight. I wanted to know where it lived. Where was it in Florida? What do we know about it? What about its general biology? Do we know anything about its natural history, its breeding cycles, its reproductive success, anything? What's going on with the status and how is it interacting with people living on ranch lands? At least that's where people reported seeing it. So what's up with that? Until I started this work, surprisingly, there really wasn't much of anything known about this bird at all. And I'm still really the only one who's studying it anywhere. I had a PhD student, James Dwyer, who did some work in the mid 2000s, and a postdoc who did some work around 2010, 2012. But other than that, it's just me. And South America, there are a lot of biologists who really are interested in the species. They've done a little work, but they don't have the resources there to do the kinds of in-depth work that we tend to have the luxury of doing as biologists here in the United States, which is unfortunate because I know they would like to do that if they could get more resources. But I do have colleagues there and they're very interested in the caracaras there. So what about, where were they? Where are caracaras and where were they? Well, historically, we don't know a lot about them. There are a few records, but we believe that they probably existed in the prairies, which are shown here. This is a 1967 map of historic vegetation from Davies, 1967, a pretty common map that shows where the prairies used to be. These dark green areas, this here is the Central Ridge. Archbold is right about here. And so caracaras lived in these open grasslands that were maintained primarily by fire by large grazers in the Pleistocene, the Miocene. There were all kinds of large camelids and buffalo and grazing animals that were keeping this landscape open, and grasslands and very few scattered trees. And that's probably where caracaras were. But today, they're primarily in habitats that are structured similarly. They're very open, scattered trees, but most of these areas now are cattle ranches. And it turned out when I started looking for nests and watching birds and figuring out where they were, that they were really all over the ranches. In other words, caracaras really like cows. They really like the ranching environments. They like what ranchers do to maintain those environments. They like the grazing. They like the poop that the cows dispense. They like the burning and the regular sort of managing of the pastures that the ranchers do. So this was a very good habitat association then that we began to understand about these caracaras. So then we need to look at reproduction. That was the next sort of big area we wanted to learn something about, because there basically was nothing. There was nothing published. There was maybe a few notes here and there, some information about historic egg collectors, but that was it. So we had to start by looking for nests, obviously, and we found nests mostly in pastures. You can probably figure out which is the nest tree here, this one. And yet these days we find them not only in pastures, but also in other open areas, open grasslands, and sometimes even in urban areas. This is a place in southern Florida, the Deer Golf Course, where birds are nesting in this date palm here. And they seem to be doing quite well. So I think as long as they have nice open habitats, a lot of good food sources, a good nesting tree, and people don't bother them, they can do just fine. So we had to get data though. We had to learn something about what their reproduction was all about. So we had to learn something about the eggs and about the nestlings. And this involves some real high-tech stuff that was in the 90s. This was way before drones and all those other things that we have today. This is my assistant here with a big, long, extendable pole with a wide angle mirror on the end of it. And this is me down here sitting, trying to avoid the cow pies, looking with binoculars to see what's in that mirror. And as the chicks grew older, we were lucky enough to be able to partner with a local tree surgeon who let us use his bucket truck to get up into the trees. You can't climb a palm tree. They're not safe and it's too hard to climb them. So we had this bucket truck that got us up there and let us get into the nests and see the eggs. This is what caracara eggs look like. You can see why they were prized by collectors for a long time. And then as we got up farther, we could begin to see the little ones. And these are 2-week-old chicks with very bad hair. And as they get older, about 4 weeks or so, they get to be what I call the blobs. They just kind of lie around and eat. They get a second coat of down, the pin feathers start to show up, but they're mostly just eating machines at this point.
Hey, Joan, it's Natasha. Can you, we've had a couple requests in the chat to slow down a little bit.
Okay.
Thank
I
you.
know I talk fast sometimes. I'll try not to do that. So I see people are still coming in too. Try to wait a little bit so that people who are coming in late won't miss too much. Okay, so these are the nestlings that we see. And right about the time they get to be 6 weeks or so, when they're the age when we can ban them, is when we would get into the trees to ban the chicks and put radio tags on them if we decided to do that. The nestlings are in the nest for about 8 weeks, 7 to 8 weeks. And when they fledge, they look like this. They're pretty silly. They play a lot. This one here is playing with some cow pies. When they're together as siblings, they tend to hang out with each other for a little while. They're very curious. They explore everything. They're snooping around looking for bugs. They start eating insects and looking for worms and edible things as soon as they get out of the nest. They tend to begin to be independent very quickly. Fledglings, the ones of the year, are very easy to recognize. You might see caracaras in the typical adult plumage with the black cap, but fledglings are really easy to recognize. First of all, they just look silly. They look like goofy teenagers. They have this very distinctive tips on their wing coverts. Here, the red arrow sort of points to that. You can tell that it's a bird of the year with those wing covert tips. A year-old bird will also be brown, but it will not have those wing covert tips. So that's one way you can tell whether you're looking at a recent fledgling or a bird that's at least a year old. And as they get to be older, 1 or 2 years, they lose the vertical streaking in the front. You can see the vertical streaking here in the front. That begins to be more of a horizontal barring. as they get to be 1 and 2 years old. And so that's a little bit about how you can tell the age differences between fledglings, we call subadults, the 1 or 2 year olds, and then they attain the adult plumage about age 3. So what did we learn about reproduction? Well, first of all, a population that's in decline or that's threatened can have reproductive problems. And if they're not reproducing, they're not producing young, or the young are not becoming breeders, then the population is going to decline. Turns out this is not a problem for Florida's caracaras. The pairs breed almost every year, and sometimes they'll breed sequentially more than one time during the year. They really like cabbage palms. That tends to be their favorite nest tree, although they do nest in other types of palms. We have nest records from cypress, from pine, from oak, basically trees that have enough structure to hold their big nests. Caracaras are the only raptors, or the only falcons, I should say, raptors, but falcons that make a nest. They actually build a stick nest. So the structure has to be solid enough to hold that nest, to hold that big nest. They've nested on cell phone towers. I've had nests behind billboards. Those are unusual, but primarily they prefer palm trees. There is no difference in clutch size from historic records. You might think that if a population is having trouble, that they would lay fewer eggs. This is not the case. Nest success is good. Pairs do quite well for the most part. On cattle ranches, they do better than the nests that are in what we would consider native, maybe native prairie like Kissimmee Prairie, or some of those other areas that are managed for native species like grasshopper sparrows, for example. The caracaras that live on ranch lands actually do better. They average 2 young a year, a little bit more than 2 young. The nesting season starts in October. I consider October 1st to be the beginning of the new nesting year, although we have had birds nesting as early as September and as late as June or July. But the peak period is October through April, which means most of the fledglings are coming out around February through March and into April. Late nests can be fledging young as late as June or July. The breeding cycle is timed somewhat to rainfall. So in the summer, when you have lots of rains, and then in the fall, the rainfall drops off, there's quite a bit of downturn in the rainfall, and that's when the birds tend to kick in their nesting cycle. So it must be that the females are getting good resources during the summer when the rainfall is producing a lot of amphibians and other food items, and then they can begin to nest in the fall. They can also nest more than once in the same year. And that's another thing that population can have trouble if they only can nest once and then the nest fails. That's it. Swallowtail kites, for example, they only nest once a year when they're up in the Florida area for only a few months, and then they have to migrate away. If that nest fails, they're done for that year. That's it. But caracaras can nest more than once. We've had pairs double brooding, and they also will nest after a failure. If something eats the eggs, or if there's a storm, the eggs are destroyed, or the nest falls out, pairs will nest again. So that's a good thing, and that helps the population maintain. So in terms of reproduction, we wanted to make sure that we knew something about what was available for food resources, because you have to have enough food resources to be able to reproduce successfully. The female has to have enough resources to produce eggs. The young have to have enough resources to survive. Caracaras are scavengers. They're not what we would call obligate scavengers, which means they don't rely totally on dead stuff like vultures do. They're facultative scavengers. They'll eat dead stuff when it's there, but they also eat pretty much everything else. And here you see them kind of having a face-off with a bald eagle. Well, they do get along quite well with vultures. They steal vulture food. But one of the things about scavengers is that they have to sort of realize that something that they think is going to be carrion is actually dead. And so when you watch a scavenger, a vulture, a caracara, or an eagle approach something that's dead on the ground, like a road-killed animal, they're very wary about it, because if it really wasn't dead, it could jump up and eat them or kill them. So scavengers in general are quite wary about approaching what appears to be a dead food item. So I had a group of students at Trinity who were really excited about tearing apart caracara barf, pellets basically, and picking apart prey remains. And we had gathered prey remains below nests and pellets below nests and roosts and dissected them And these students did a great job of identifying bones, insect parts, and all kinds of things. Published a couple papers on their diet. Turns out they pretty much eat everything. I had a picture taken by one of my students of a bird that was holding a container of Philadelphia cream cheese. We managed to Photoshop that out and get the cover of Southeastern Naturalist. We had another one that was eating macaroni and cheese along the side of the road. I don't know where that macaroni and cheese came from, but there it was. We found a significant number of fire ants in their pellets, which was pretty amazing. I mean, many, many fire ants. The question was, are they eating the fire ants on purpose, or are they getting them in association with eating something dead, for example, because fire ants tend to be on dead things? Not really sure. There was plant material in the pellets, lots of grasses and plant material. There are other publications of caracaras eating pecans, eating palm fruits, other vegetation kinds of things. So they really are quite Catholic in terms of their diet. Here you can see a lot of mud turtle shells, little mud turtles, kind of sternin turtles. They love those little turtles. So here's sort of the breakdown of what we found in terms of their diet. A lot of mammals, rabbits, armadillos, they love rabbits, they love armadillos, they love little piglets. Fish, lots of fish, presumably as wetlands dry up in the fall and the wetlands become concentrated, any fish in those wetlands become concentrated, become easy prey for caracaras wading around the edges. Reptiles, birds, amphibians, frogs, of course, tadpoles, even amphiuma that we think are dredged up when the machinery is dredging up dirt and things out of the ditches, that the amphiumas become available on the piles next to the canals. And of course, insects are pretty much in every single pellet that we looked at. So it turns out that carrion is really only about a third of their diet. Carrion is ephemeral, which means it's not predictable. You don't know when an animal's going to die. And so therefore you can't rely only on carrion if you're a relatively smaller scavenger like the caracara. Vultures in Africa, for example, there's always going to be some dead large herbivore around. And so vultures can rely on carrion for the most part. And vultures are also very large, which is what happens when you're relying on ephemeral resources. You can have a large body size so that when you finally get to eat something, you can eat a whole lot of it. So anyway, people think that caracaras are only scavengers. That's only part of their diet. Turns out they do eat a lot of bugs, and we did some bug analysis. We were lucky enough to work with Tom Eisner at Cornell when he was alive still, analyzing some of these bugs and some of the toxic chemicals that are in some of the bugs. A lot of these bugs have, these beetles have markings. Here's a Nephrotes beetle with an orange along the back of its elytra that would signal that maybe this beetle is toxic. Caracaras ate a lot of those beetles. Presumably they get them when they're eating carrion, and presumably they have some kind of immune response that lets them not be affected by eating those toxic substances. We had a paper written with Tom about that, and there are a lot of chemicals in those bugs that you think would make an animal sick, but it doesn't make caracaras sick at all. So that was pretty interesting. So my PhD student, James Dwyer, wanted to take a look at the life cycle part that I did not look at. I looked at adults, the breeding and the reproductive success and the diet, but he wanted to learn about these youngsters, the subadults. What happens when the birds leave the nest and go off and try to survive and find their own places? So he was looking at these groups, and it turns out that you can find large groups of caracaras in some areas. The groups kind of move around. They're not always in the same areas, but sometimes you'll see as many as this picture shows in places where there's abundant food resource, like maybe they had just plowed some sugarcane, burned some sugarcane, and all of a sudden there's resources, so these birds would show up. And he recorded a lot of interesting behaviors when he was watching these groups, the fighting that occurred around a carcass, around a food source, sort of a dominance hierarchy of the birds around these food sources, and some of the fighting, some of the behaviors. Here's, again, that head throwback behavior. This is something that the birds do when they're agitated, when they want to sort of throw their weight around and say, don't come to this food source, this is mine. It's pretty remarkable. It looks like their head's going to be completely backwards. It's a very strange sound that they emit when they're doing this. It's like a rattle, a metallic rattle. You may have heard it if you've you haven't, you can get on Birds of the World and listen to lots of calls that have been recorded. So he did a lot of work with these subadults and these groups, and he tagged a lot of those birds and discovered a whole network of communal roosts around their range. And so these yellow dots are the communal roosts that he identified. There probably are more, but those are the ones that he found. The blue dots are radiolocations of birds. And it turned out that these birds traveled between these communal roosts, and they would go back and forth and sort of basically travel all around the range of their species between these communal roosts. And he did this all year. And the other thing that he found that was pretty cool was that during the summer, when there's not much breeding going on, the birds would have a relatively small home range. These red areas are the home ranges of different subadult birds, for example. And then during the breeding season, all of a sudden, they began to range all over the place. They would range widely. So the blue areas, and you can't really tell which is associated with which bird, but the point is during the non-breeding season, the birds weren't moving around much. They sort of stayed around the communal roost and stayed around the pastures where they were. But during the breeding season, they were all over the place. And presumably they were looking for openings or empty territorial spots where they could move in and find a pair, establish a pair, establish a nest site and a territory. So that was pretty much the crux of what he did. So currently what I'm working on is the question of what happens to breeding pairs when their nest tree or their foraging habitat is converted to other land uses. And the reason we're doing this is because habitat in Florida continues to be lost. We know that. Urban development is rampant, it's expanding widely and quickly. There's a lot of pressure for that. Land values are going up. Ranch lands are disappearing. Other natural habitats are disappearing. It's hard to protect these areas. And caracaras need ranch lands, need open these grasslands with wetlands and scattered trees, just like this aerial photograph shows. This is kind of ideal caracara real estate right here. The other thing that we found when we're looking at habitat associations and radiotelemetry, home range work, is that we believe that all the habitat that's suitable for caracara nesting is already occupied. And that means that if habitat is taken away and the birds are reproducing successfully. Okay, so just briefly, this is the current research question because we all know that habitat is disappearing and we want to know what happens to breeding pairs when this happens, when the habitat is lost. Nest tree or foraging habitat is converted to other land uses like houses or reservoirs or STAs, anything where caracaras can't live. And we're using this new GPS GSM technology to do that. The telemetry units are now small enough. They don't have an external antenna, which is good, and they're solar power driven. The little panel on the back is shown here. And again, this issue of habitat saturation is a real concern because this means that all suitable habitat for nesting is occupied. And so all those young birds that are flying around trying to find places to breed and throughout the breeding season, traveling everywhere looking for an opening, can't find them because presumably all the habitat that's suitable is already occupied. And when there is a loss, a bird dies or is somehow lost from the territory, replacement is almost instantaneous, which suggests to us that there's a lot of birds out there looking that cannot find a place. So this is a picture of two projects that are ongoing, showing radiotelemetry for all these different caracaras associated with these projects. Now, not all of them. Obviously, you can see some red dots there that are nests of pairs that we don't have radios on. But you can see, what I want you to see here is how specific those home ranges are. Those territories hardly ever overlap. Very few colored dots of one color in somebody else's color, basically. The only area this happens is right here. There's a communal roost that we discovered with this telemetry, and birds from this entire project here, this bird and this bird, actually all of them have been to that communal roost. And in some cases, this is quite a distance. And so there's some importance about those communal roosts as communication places or places where birds can find mates. But anyway, communal roosts are very cool. And this is a big one here associated with these projects. So I want you to see how specific they are in terms of their home range and how territorial they are. They're very, very territorial. They don't like other birds in their territory at all. So here's the problem. We have what's called, I like to call Florida succession, what used to be native prairie, now converted to cattle pastures, but moving from there through citrus, sugarcane, or big water reservoirs, deep water reservoirs, and ultimately to urban. And for caracaras, this is a one-way trip. And this is not habitat that's coming back or being maintained in many areas. You do find an occasional pair that finds a place to nest in a golf course or in a semi-urban area, but this is not where caracaras live. They don't like dense houses. So this is what we face in terms of conservation of its population, is how to identify and protect habitat for the pairs that we have. And I like to call this problem sort of the issue of a fishbowl, where you have a fishbowl of a certain size, and inside that fishbowl is a whole bunch of fish that can live in there. But then the fish are making more fish. They're breeding and making more and more fish, in this case, birds. And the fishbowl is shrinking. And so you can imagine when you have increasing numbers of birds in a fishbowl that's continually shrinking, you're not going to have persistence of this population over the long term, because you'll have a lot of individuals that will never be able to breed. And then as the current breeders die off and the new ones can't find a place, the population will decline. So we also tried to explore caracara relationships with humans, because they were living on ranches and ranchers saw them all the time, and they drove around their equipment and had a lot of stories to tell actually about caracaras and other wildlife. And during my dissertation work, I was really fortunate to be able to work with a lot of ranchers on their properties. And they would come out with us, they would watch us do our thing with the birds, do the banding and the telemetry work. We wrote a lot of articles. I talked to the Florida cattlemen. It was really a good relationship, and still is to some degree, with those ranchers who want to maintain that lifestyle and that way of making a living. The challenge is now that, especially for a lot of the older people, the ranches are being sold. The younger people don't want to maintain that lifestyle anymore. They want money, they sell the land, and it becomes houses or something else that caracaras don't like. The other relationship with humans, and this is something we've sort of discovered recently, is that for some reason, these birds like to stand on vehicles and pick at windshield wipers and do the kinds of things that vultures do that are really annoying to visitors to the Everglades. And we don't know why they do that, but they pick on wipers, they pick on rubber around windows. Very strange. And that's been a little bit frustrating. So we're trying to figure out what that's all about, but frankly, I have no idea. So the bottom line is, for now, the population's doing okay because their reproduction is doing well and they're able to live in the places that they still have. But some recent genetic work that was done, it's been published, and it's a methodology that uses genetic information. We had over 300 samples from the Florida population that estimates what's called effective population size, which is actually the number of birds that are in fact breeding, contributing to the genetic pool. And that seems to be about 280 pairs at this point, which would be about 560 adults. Maybe another 300, 400, or 500 young birds. We don't know about that. But there could be an overall population in the state of about 1,000 birds. And so one might ask, well, is that enough? How do people feel about the number of 500 or the number of 1,000? Is that enough to keep the population persistent over time? That's the question. And we're not really sure at this point. They do live in Florida year round. They do not migrate. They do not leave the state, as far as we know. They are not all that visible in the summer, but mostly it's because it's hot and they're hanging out either on the ground or in a palm tree somewhere in the shade. They have very strong habitat preferences for open grasslands with scattered trees, and they're very, very faithful. Pairs are very faithful to their breeding territory, to their site, to their nest site, even to their nest tree. So strong site fidelity is another reason why, when their habitat is gone, they may not have another place to go because they were strongly associated with that particular. As habitat continues to disappear, this becomes more of a concern. Many of the agencies are still permitting habitat loss, and I have some issues with that. That's a challenge. We worry about flooding with water. We worry about agricultural runoff. There's a lot of conflicting interests, as we know, with a lot of our endangered species in Florida, but this happens to be one of them, is that habitat is continually being lost and permitted, and that's maybe affecting the birds. So the outlook for long-term persistence of this population is tenuous. We really need to do some serious population modeling or something like that to get a better handle on what the extinction probability is for this population. I have not been asked to do that, and Fish and Wildlife at this point doesn't seem interested in funding. But in terms of conservation, and there's a lot of things going on now with the corridor, you probably all know about that, with Archbold being sort of situated in the middle of the areas where a lot of these grasslands are. They're working very hard to work with landowners to conserve habitat, to put these ranches into conservation easements. There are mechanisms to do that, and we're really hoping that that can continue so that some of these lands can remain where the caracaras can persist. Okay, now I'm going to shift gears here. And this is where I want you to open your mind to think about where caracaras are and where they go. So I've started working in Arizona. I started in about 2017. And my colleagues out there in the wintertime would see all these groups of caracaras like here in these agricultural fields. There's a big area of agricultural fields between Phoenix and Tucson. And there would be birds, up to 100 caracaras in these ag fields in the wintertime. But in the summertime, they were gone. And nobody knew where they went. Nobody knew who they were. So it's kind of like, who are these guys? Where are they coming from? Where are they going? Why are they not here year round? And people were looking. And so that was sort of the research question. And of course, Arizona looks really different from Florida for lots of reasons. One interesting one is that they tend to nest in saguaro cactuses. Here's a nest here. They have to be big. They have to have arms, and the nests are really huge. And that's where we find them nesting in these saguaros. And often on the side of the saguaro that's away from the sun. So that would be the north side or the northeast side, so that the young in the nest here can be shaded by the arms and by the big nest from the hot Arizona sun. So this kind of was what was driving our research. And we started trying to tag individuals in these groups and figure out where they went. That was a challenge, but we finally were successful. And since 2017, we've had 5 tagged caracaras that have lived for quite some time. We've tagged others, but there's been mortality. But what we've discovered is that these birds really move around. And here, these dots represent actually 2 birds that went to Mexico. And when they disappeared in the summer, I sort of felt like, well, yeah, they're going to go to Mexico probably because it's contiguous and there's no reason why they couldn't go back and forth. And now we have proof, and that's pretty cool. That's really cool stuff. And where they are in Mexico, if you look at this nice vegetation map here, they're west of the mountains and along the coastal areas and the agricultural areas. There's really a lot of pasture and agricultural areas in these places where the birds are going. And they go far. Even within Arizona, they're covering a whole lot of that area between Phoenix and Tucson, and even extending a little bit farther west into the areas north and west of Phoenix. Sometimes during the day, they fly up to 140 kilometers. 140, 150 kilometers in a daily flight. That was not uncommon. The 2 individuals that went to Mexico, longest single movement within a day was 166 kilometers. Those 2 individuals went to Mexico. They came back to Arizona. One of them remained in Arizona, and the other one has been back in Mexico again. So there's clearly movement back and forth of these birds, and probably a lot of the birds we see in the wintertime there in Arizona are Mexican birds. Right now, one of the birds is way down here in Sinaloa. Along the coast, it roosts in the wooded areas at night, but it just goes back and forth from the ag areas along the coast into those wooded areas. So some pretty cool, neat new stuff. We want to continue with it. Not big scale at this point. We don't have a lot of funding, but I think we're learning some interesting things and certainly generating a whole lot more questions. And that brings up the question of these vagrants. What's up with that? So here's a blow up of the US that shows all of these purple squares where there has been an occurrence. Probably all of you know there's been recently an occurrence of a bird on Prince Edward Island out here near Nova Scotia. There's another recent one in California. And if you look up and down both coasts, you see records. And you think, oh, well, they're just ranging up and down the coast. Well, they're not ranging. Those are records. Some of those records are old if you actually get into eBird and look at them. But the point is, what's going on here? You're seeing them in other places too. Why is this happening? Who are these birds? Why is it happening? How often does it happen? Where are they coming from? And at least until the one in California recently, every single one of them that I've seen has been an adult. And you wouldn't expect that. You would expect young birds to be moving around out of their range, perhaps, but that's not seems to be what's happening. You might think that the birds from Florida are going up the East Coast, and that may be happening just because we haven't seen any band records or had any telemetry data. to show that. Doesn't mean that it's not happening. The birds up the West Coast are likely coming from Baja California, perhaps from Arizona, perhaps even from Texas. We did have a bird in Arkansas back in 2017 that I tagged in Arkansas and went back to Texas. But the point being that these birds are moving around, I think, a lot more than maybe we give them credit for. And maybe as climate change is making things happen, as for many birds, that maybe caracaras are responding as well. But again, many more questions are being generated than answers. So raptors among us, who else do we have here? We have lots of them, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with them. We all know that swallowtail kites are starting to come back. This is a picture from Harkey's website of all the tagged birds that they had. This is an older picture, but you can see where they follow very specific tracks, either around the coast or very quickly they jump from Florida to Cuba over to Yucatan and then down into a very small area in South America where they winter. Red-shouldered hawks are common in the urban areas. Ph.D. student recently who did her work in Miami on red-shouldered hawks. Red-tailed hawks, not as common, at least in the Hartford area where I was, but they're around. Short-tailed hawks, and they're interesting because they have what we call two-color morphs. Maybe all of you are familiar with dimorphism. Dimorphism can be either differences in color or differences in size. You have color dimorphism in the kestrel. Males are very different from females. In the harrier, males are different from females. But you can also have, and this is morphs, this is not sex related, this is just different colors of birds of both sexes in the short-tailed hawk, and that seems to be of interest. Of course, we have bald eagles now. Bald eagles are coming back with a vengeance pretty much everywhere. I can see more bald eagles now in 2 or 3 days in Florida than I could see the entire 6 years I lived there. So they're everywhere, and I think they have change the dynamic of scavengers around Florida. So when there's a carcass and vultures show up and caracaras show up and eagles show up, all of a sudden the whole dynamic changes because everybody hates eagles. Caracaras hate eagles. And so I think that may have affected where some of the pairs are nesting and some of the interactions around carcasses, things like that. Juvenile bald eagles are quite different. We all know ospreys. Snail kites, again, have that color dimorphism between males and females. And then we have owls. And unless you're a night person, you probably don't see these guys much, but they're out there. And you see a color dimorphism again in screech owls. Again, not sex related, just a color morph. Barn owls, they tend to hang around ranches and eat a lot of the small mammals, which is a good thing. Barred owls live in the hammocks on the ranches, and they may be predators on young caracaras or eggs, and certainly great horned owls would be predators as well, as are raccoons. But all of our raptor friends are suffering from a lot of threats. And we talked about caracaras specifically, but these are some of the general threats that are faced by raptors everywhere. And these are things we can do something about. And hopefully we will. I think educating people about the issues and about the dangers can help remove the threat, hopefully, or at least mitigate the threat so that these things don't happen. These rodenticides, second generation rodenticides, are very common. People use them all over the place in their houses. You can buy the little green pellets. You might make sure you don't want to leave them out for your pets, but leave them out and mice eat them and rats eat them. And they're hemorrhagic, which means that when the rodent eats these pellets, they bleed to death. And so, but it's a slow process. And when a rodent is out staggering around in the process of dying from eating this thing, a raptor says, oh, look at that easy prey item. I'm going to eat that rat. Eats the rat, and then the raptor bleeds to death. And I've seen it. It happened a lot in Hartford. It was a huge problem with the red tails there. And it's a horrible death. So we try not to do that. And we should pass the word around that rodenticides should be used very carefully or not at all when possible. In other words, clean up the garbage and you don't have rat. Feral pets, unsupervised pets. Don't get me started on outside cats. Feral dogs in packs can be a problem. And of course, vehicles are a problem as well. So we always have to be alert and attentive, careful, and managing our pets, our houses, and our food and our garbage in appropriate ways so that we're not endangering our raptor friends. These are just some of my favorite photos taken by local people, by Christina Evans up at Kissimmee Prairie. A lot of you may know her and her photographs. I think this was an award winner last year. There's a woman in Texas here, Patty Rainey, who takes a lot of great pictures of caracaras and sends them to me all the time. This is interesting. This is something called allopreening. This is a behavior that occurs between species or between a pair of caracaras, for example. They'll preen each other, kind of like primates grooming each other. It can be a pair bonding thing, a pair of caracaras. It can be a stress relieving or an aggressive relieving behavior. And then another good friend of mine in Florida there, Linda Jansen, who takes a lot of pictures of her pair that she's monitoring at all. And throughout these decades now, my project has been partnered with a whole lot of different groups and people, federal agencies, state agencies. Of course, it's all centered out of Archbold Biological Station and Buck Island Ranch. If you haven't been up there lately, take a trip. It's really great. The ranch is wonderful. I lived out there during the whole time I was doing my research, and it's a wonderful place. And of course, the Florida cattlemen have been very supportive about my assertion that caracaras love their ranches. University of Florida was supportive in every way. And I guess that would be it. If there are any questions, I will be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Joan. I learned a lot today. So that was a really good presentation. All right, so there are some questions in the chat. Everybody, please keep putting your questions in the chat for Dr. Joan. So our first question comes from Jeanette Mitchell, and she would like to know, do tree trimmers look for caracara before they do annual tree trimmings?
Linda, do you want to answer that? No, the answer is no. They don't, unless they're asked to do that, or unless they're told that there might be nests in the trees. So if you live in a place where there might be nesting trees, or where you think you might know where a nest is, you might talk with your, if you have a facilities manager or landscaper manager, and encourage them to look for nests, but also to, maybe you can work on some kind of a program where the trees could be trimmed outside of the nesting season and not during a time when the birds are nesting. I had instances where trees were trimmed and nests fell out on the ground, and when that happens, sometimes the young can survive. But if the mower comes around, then that's another problem. So again, education and communication is.
That's a good message. Next question comes from Gail. She would like to know, so what has happened this year when rainfall and temperatures have been so unusual? So how would that impact caracara nesting behavior?
What do you mean by unusual? More or less or hotter or colder? Because I can answer that, but I need more information.
I'm not sure. It has been quite warm this year as well, and then we're getting colder temperatures now. So maybe talk about both scenarios a little bit.
Well, when I was doing my dissertation work, I did it for 3 years. And of course, the first 2 years were completely different. So then I had to do the third year to figure out what was really normal. And it turned out that the year that had higher precipitation in the wintertime, there was more nest failure. And when it's very cold in the early winter, like pairs will nest early. And as we all know, the early bird gets the worm. Pairs that nest early tend to do better. They tend to have a second brood. But you also run the risk of failure early because it could be a cold storm early, or a snowstorm or rainstorm or something early. So it sort of depends on the combination of temperature and rainfall. If this year has been excessively dry, then they're probably doing well because they really take advantage of those wetlands that are drying up and shrinking all the food items that they can get to. Whereas when it's really wet, then those places get flooded and the food resources are spread out and they're harder to find. So hope
That makes sense. Next question is from Lorraine. She'd like to know, can construction and a development be stopped if a nest is found?
Ideally, yes. That kind of thing needs to go to the Fish and Wildlife Service. And typically when a nest is found, a buffer is put around it. 300 meters is the minimum. That is a sort of no activity allowed within that area during the nesting season, during the time when the nest is active and they're still in the nest and being fed by the parents. So if you know of those situations, the best thing to do would be to approach either FWC or the Fish and Wildlife Service and let them know about that situation. They should be able to step forward and at least slow the construction or put a buffer around the nest and have them stay out of that area until it's finished.
You mentioned that 300 meters is the minimum buffer. What is the maximum buffer? I just think it's a good number for people to hear.
2,000 meters.
Yeah, so it's a really large amount of area around these nests where activity is impacted
Mhm.
when nests are known and rules are followed.
Yeah, and their home ranges could be quite large. I mean, territories range anywhere from 900 to 3,000 acres. And so that's why the 2,000-meter radius around an active nest is considered an area that would be impacted by any kind of construction.
Yeah, and that map you showed with the territories was really interesting to see because it kind of highlights that fact of that, they're utilizing that amount of space and it shows why those buffers are important.
Mhm.
Um, Next question is from Diane. Diane says, so Dr. Joan, do you have to get permission from ranchers or property owners to explore and study the life of these caracara?
Absolutely. Yeah. And when we found nests, usually we found nests from driving the roads, then I would find out who the landowner was and approach them and ask permission, always ask permission. Um, Back in the 90s, it was much easier than it is today. It's not so simple as it used to be. And I think just the times and the way people value land is different now. But yes, always we ask permission. We don't always
I
get it. Most of the time, back in the day, we did.
was gonna ask.
Drink a lot of coffee in people's kitchens back in the day.
That's nice.
Yeah.
Next question is from Elaine. She wants to know, is it possible to erect nesting platforms similar to osprey nesting platforms that are used?
We haven't tried that. I don't know. I don't know whether that would work or not. I think it would be an interesting experiment. You'd have to be able to do it in a place where there was suitable foraging habitat too, because it's not just the nest structure. It's the foraging habitat that they require that could be that couple thousand acres. And that includes, grasslands, wetlands. They really are very tied to wetlands. They're tied to ephemeral wetlands and the ditches that are within pasture lands, because that's where a lot of the prey items are. And so you have to have that amount of foraging habitat associated with a place where you might put up a structure. But that would be cool to try.
What about if a nest failed and they wanted to encourage development, something like that happened, and they wanted to encourage the caracara to remain in that territory? Would that be a situation where if they tried to put up something in the same spot?
Possibly. Again, planting a cabbage palm would probably be better. But again, they have to have the foraging area. You could go in and build a whole bunch of houses and put up a cabbage palm, and if there's no foraging habitat, then it won't work. But a lot of things to think about.
Yep.
Again, would
Uh,
be
next, yep. The next question was from Kay Gates. She wanted to know, and you did touch on this briefly. So are they in New Mexico and Southern California as well?
Um, as far as we know, there's no populations there. New
Okay.
Mexico is very different. We don't have a lot of things that seem to jump over us from Texas to Arizona. For example, we don't have cardinals. Cardinals in Arizona and Texas, but we don't have them in New Mexico. Caracara records here are very sparse. There's nothing recent, I don't think, but we don't have any nesting pairs or what I would consider a population. And that's true in California. Obviously, there have been a lot of records there, but they tend to be associated with wildlife refuges and places like that. And as far as I know, there's been no records of nesting there. It's just occurrences people see or once in a while. Yeah, but who knows?
Next, Elaine just had a statement. She says that the second generation anticoagulant rodenticides are banned in California. So she was
Mm.
just sharing that information with everybody. Anne Wiley says that the US should follow the example, Australia's example of reducing feral cat populations because of the impacts that they have on wildlife. Ryan Egan says, what are the best places to spot caracaras in South Florida? Or is it better to travel to Central Florida?
Henry County, you can still see them quite a bit. Let's see. Yeah, some of the big ranches in Hendry County and some of the secondary roads. If you come south from Clewiston on, I think it's 835 to head down towards the projects there. And then that road takes a hard turn to the west when you get to sort of the southern end of it. And along that road, all the way over towards the Dinner Island Wildlife Management Area, back up towards 80, there's a lot of caracaras in there. So you can sort of see, and in Henry County, I would drive some of the back roads in Henry County that have ranches along them, and you would see them there.
Yeah, I feel like they're all concentrated on that road. We see them out there all the time.
Mhm. Yeah, Kissimmee State
Um,
Park has them. People have commented there, and that's very true. You can always see them
okay, so Kissimmee State Park, you had mentioned State Road 70 as well when you
there.
were in your presentation, and then Henry County.
Hmm.
So BJ Saul just says, fabulous presentation. Thank you so much. Robert has a comment that he heard that some New Jersey records of Caracara were actually escaped pets of some of the migrant workers in the area. Have you ever heard that rumor before?
Well, when I first started hearing about these vagrants, that's of course the first thing to think about because you think they don't live there. They're obviously somebody's escaped bird. But first of all, it's illegal to have them. And second of all, they're not kept by falconers because they are not good falconry species. Um, and the likelihood of people having them in a place like New Jersey and getting away with it for any length of time would not be very great, I would think. I tend to think that's probably not what's happening. There are too many of them at this point to be that. Whether that might have been a one-off, if there was somebody who was keeping one, maybe. But I think there's just too many vagrants seen now that that's probably not most of them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Marissa Hodap has a question for you, Joan. Marissa says, what are your next goals when working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service?
Well, this year when I come out, which hopefully is soon, they've had some personnel turnover. And so I would like to interact with those new people and talk to them and find out sort of what their status is in terms of their thinking about the population. There are some major steps that need to be taken now. I mentioned developing some kind of a population viability analysis or population modeling exercise that would look at time to extinction. There's also been some suggestion of a tool, a habitat tool that would be used across a big landscape area to predict where pairs might be so that consultants going in to monitor for projects could have an idea about the probability of actually finding something. Those are two ideas I've proposed before that have sort of not gone anywhere, but I would like to see them go somewhere. So maybe that would be the next conversation.
That would be amazing to have a tool like that. Nancy would like to know, do caracaras mate for life?
Well, there really aren't very many birds that do that. I mean, when you start, we all sort of have that Ozzie and Harriet idea about that. But when you start banding birds and putting radios on them and tracking them over periods of time, you find that that's really not often the case. We know about a lot of species that have what we call EPCs, extra pair copulations. That's very common in birds. We do know that caracaras, at least the ones we've had banded, as long as they are alive, presumably they remain on the territory, but we don't, I've had some switching. I've had some territory switching. Um, I think probably they would stay in a territory as long as they're alive, but the mate for life thing, probably not really. Because yeah, we have had some switching.
Scott says that he understands that the number of saguaro cactus, I can never pronounce that,
Mhm.
are starting to decline because of the increased heat and wildfires in the desert as a result of climate change. Is that affecting the caracara?
Um, we don't know. I mean, we don't know enough about the general population there to know how much that's happening. In the areas where we're working, they still tend to have a lot of natural habitat. We don't see that so much, but there have been serious places outside of Phoenix, for example. There was an area where they had a huge fire several years ago and it just burned up all the saguaros and everything. Terrible. Whether climate change will affect the saguaros, probably, but they're so old. They grow, the big ones like that with multiple arms are hundreds of years old. It'll take a long time to see an effect. And so we don't really know how that will happen. Um, but those are really the only structures out there that they can nest in. The rest of the vegetation is pretty low. And so if they're not saguaros, I don't know what they would use. It would be rather interesting.
Bad. Diane Evans would just like to be reminded again of what the breeding season is in South Florida for Caracara.
I consider it October through April, with a peak egg laying is in January, late January to early February. So kind of right about now, they should be laying eggs like crazy.
Yep, it's going on now. Um, so Scott again says he was surprised to hear that there's no current research being done on the crested caracara besides your research. What additional research do you believe is needed, and is there any way that we can help to promote more research?
Um, well, it's not happening in Texas, primarily because most of well, all of Texas is private land, and getting access to private land is very difficult. And I think one of the reasons why nobody ever studied them in Florida before me is because of the private land issue. It's difficult to get on land. People don't want to deal with it. The Fish and Wildlife certainly doesn't want to deal with it. Um, it's not like going on a national park or a public land somewhere where anybody can go on and do research. That's easy. But private land research is challenging. It's different. And I think that's been an issue everywhere. And in Texas, nobody studied them there because there have been a couple people in academia there that have been able to work with the King Ranch to do a few things, but in conjunction with other research. There's nothing been focused. Plus, there's so many of them there, they're almost considered pests. They're not on anybody's list in Texas or Arizona. And I think they suffer to some degree from the whole bad rap that scavengers get. You know, vultures, people are like, ew, they're gross. You know, they barf and they smell and they eat dead stuff. And caracaras are somewhat aligned in that kind of impression. And so I think that's something we sort of need to overcome because they're amazingly cool birds. I mean, they're very smart. They remember people, they remember vehicles, they remember circumstances, they recognize all kinds of things, and they're incredibly smart. And so I think people should think more about that and realize how cool we are or how lucky you are to have them in Florida. Um, and I think the research there is, as I mentioned, the habitat model and the population model. Arizona, of course, needs research as well, but there's just really no interest there and certainly no money. And it's a much bigger landscape to deal with. It's a harder problem.
Um, Kay Gates is just letting the person who asked earlier, I'm sorry, I forgot the name, that Caracara also in Kissimmee Prairie State Park. Brian Garrett has he says, I've noticed several caracara with animal feces on their beaks over the years. Do you have any idea what's going on in these situations?
They're eating them. Caracaras love to pick on cow pies, and they flip them over, they dig into them. If you picked up turned over a cow pie, try it sometime. There are tons of worms under there and bugs, and that's what they're doing. They're flipping the pies and getting worms and bugs. And if they're eating dead stuff, they'll get blood on their beaks or tissue, you know, from the dead thing. That's just something that happens when they eat. It's not. Apparently, they're into it. They don't get bothered by it.
Linda says, great presentation. That's all the questions right now. I actually have a question. So you mentioned about Caracara biting at the rubber and stuff on vehicles or stuff like that, and we're not really sure why they're attracted to it. Has anybody ever looked at what like amino acids are released from rubber as it's heated up or something and see if they're similar to amino acids that are released by things that the caracara eat often?
No, and then that's one of the hypotheses that I had is that they're smelling something. You know, everybody says, well, birds don't smell. Well, we know that turkey vultures smell. And I think other birds smell too. I'm not sure whether caracaras do or not. The jury's still out on that. I think it's possible they smell a few things. I don't know. The VOCs, it could be that they're exuding VOCs, but some of the vehicles are not new. They're old. So are the things still emitting chemicals? I don't know. Is it something that maybe a bird starts doing just for something to do and then others watch it and learn and do it because they've seen it happen? I think that's possible. I don't know whether anybody's looked into it for vultures. I know the vultures do it like crazy down in the park and other places, but I don't know whether anybody's investigated that either. So it's one of those things that I just really have no good response for, unfortunately. But they've done it to my truck, so yeah, I get it too.
We had a problem with some of our contractors at the
Mhm,
CARACARA were doing that.
mhm.
Well, this was an amazing presentation. Thank you so much for taking the time to present for our group. I learned a lot. Everybody learned a lot. So I'm going to hand it back over to Scott. And thank you again.
Thank you.
Joan, thank you so much. That was great. And it was great. That was a great expression on Natasha's face when you talked about how Caracara is like uh, feces. So that was fascinating. But it was such a great presentation. I learned so much also, and we so appreciated having you. And hopefully, maybe there's a way to encourage research in Florida. Hopefully, with the new conservation corridor that's happening in Central Florida, and a lot of these lands now going into kind of conservation, becoming conservation parcels, perhaps there'll be more access on these properties.
Yeah, hopefully. And the Fish and Wildlife really has some initiatives going, trying to get other areas put aside into refuges as well. And so those things come out as requesting public comment. So people can always pay attention to that and make public comment on those proposed activities. Writing to your Fish and Wildlife offices is always helpful too. Just getting involved as the public is always helpful to us.
Well,
Thank you.
thank you for that advice, Joan. That's great, and hopefully that's something that some of our members will do, and to help further research on Crested Caracara. Thanks again. Have a wonderful evening, Joan.
Yes, thank you. You too. It was nice seeing everybody, and thanks for the good questions.
Great.
Good night.
Well, thanks everybody. Thanks for joining us. Thank you for all the help, for Mark Slifkin, Mary Young from behind the scenes, for Natasha for introducing and handling the Q&A, and of course Sabina Begg for creating my hosting slides, which look incredible, and I wouldn't have without her. I hope you have a great evening. I hope you join us on March 5th for Dr. Stephen Whitfield and his incredible talk on flamingos. I can't wait. And this recording, by the way, will appear on our YouTube channel, so you'll be able to see it again or share it with your friends, who I'm sure will love it as much as we all did this evening. Anyway, have a great evening, and hope you get out there and bird and get on some of our field trips, and don't forget to participate in the backyard bird count, because every contribution adds to the count statistics and all that is used for citizen science. So be sure to participate, and we'll see you on the flip side. Take care, everybody. Good night.